At 6:17 on a cold October morning, an old woman stood ankle-deep in black swamp water, her hands wrapped around the control of a rusted logging winch. She was 67 years old. Her back ached. Her fingers were numb. And every single person she knew back in Boston believed she had lost her mind. 2 years ago, she had buried her husband. 30 years ago, she had buried her only daughter. And now she stood alone, in a swamp, in Vermont, on a piece of land nobody wanted. The steel cable tightened. It hummed like a violin string pulled too far. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the mud moved. A line of bubbles broke the surface 20 yards away. Reeds leaned sideways, as if something enormous had just turned, over in its sleep beneath them. The winch groaned, and slowly, impossibly, something began to rise from the black water. Eleanor Whitfield held her breath. What came out of that swamp would change everything. Not just her life, but an entire century of secrets that powerful men had spent generations trying to bury. She didn't know it yet, but beneath her feet lay 1,700 logs, waiting 128 years for the right person to come along and pull them into the light. By the time she was finished, the wood hidden beneath 40 worthless acres would be worth more than the entire farm above it. But the money was never the real treasure. The real treasure was what a broken heart learns when it finally decides to stop running. The rain had been falling for 3 days when Eleanor Whitfield first saw the farm. Not a hard rain, the kind that soaks slowly, the kind that finds every crack in your coat, the kind that makes an old woman question every decision she has ever made in her life. She was 67 years old, and she was about to spend every dollar she had left on a piece of land nobody wanted. The realtor's name was Douglas Merrick, 50-something, thick around the middle, wearing boots too clean for a man who claimed to sell farms for a living. He kept looking at his watch. He kept sighing. He had already shown her the house, already walked her through the barn, already pointed out the collapsed shed and the leaking roof. Now he was standing in the mud, 20 feet from a line of dark water, looking like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. "That's the Southern 40, he said. Eleanor said nothing. "Nothing much you can do with that section, Mrs. Whitfield." "Why not?" Douglas turned, looked at her. She wasn't asking. She was informing him that she was about to ask questions he wouldn't be able to answer. "Well," he said, "it's wet. I can see that. Real wet. Yes. You couldn't drain it. Costs more than the land is worth." "Says who?" Douglas blinked. Eleanor Whitfield had spent her career as an emergency room nurse. Decades of holding hands of people dying from things she couldn't fix. She was not afraid of a wet field. She was not afraid of Douglas Merrick. And she was certainly not afraid of the number written at the bottom of the paperwork he was holding in his water-stained folder. $168,000. For everything. The house, the barn, the pasture, the road access, and the 40 acres of swamp Douglas Merrick was currently pretending did not exist. "I'll take it," she said. Douglas stared at her. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Douglas." "Yes." "Do I look unsure to you?" He drove her back to town in silence. The check she wrote that afternoon cleared everything. Her savings, her pension buyout, the life insurance from Arthur, the small settlement from selling the Boston apartment she and Arthur had lived in for 31 years. All of it, every dollar. Her nephew called her the next morning. His name was Owen Hargrave. He was 28 years old. He worked in insurance in Providence. He was the son of Eleanor's younger sister Margaret, who had died of ovarian cancer 12 years ago. Owen was the only family Eleanor had left in the world, and he was not happy. "Aunt Nell." "Owen, you did what?" "You heard me. Aunt Nell. I bought a farm." "You bought a what?" "A farm." "Where?" "Vermont." "Aunt Nell." "Owen, you are 67 years old." "I am aware of my age, Owen. 67-year-old women do not buy farms." "This one just did." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Owen was doing the thing he always did when he was upset. She could picture it perfectly. He was pinching the bridge of his nose. He was closing his eyes. He was counting to 10. Aunt Nell. Yes. Come to Providence. No. I have a guest room. I don't want a guest room. You could live near me. Owen. I could take care of you. And there it was. The sentence that had been waiting under every conversation with her nephew for the past 2 years. Ever since Arthur's funeral. Ever since Owen had sat in her kitchen watching her pour tea, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and decided in that moment that Aunt Nell was now something that needed to be taken care of. She loved him for it, and she couldn't stay near him for exactly that reason. Because if she stayed in Boston, if she moved to Providence, if she sat in a guest room and let her nephew bring her groceries and check on her and worry about her every single day, she would die. Not of anything a doctor could name. Just die. Slowly. Quietly. From the inside out. The way she had almost died once already. 30 years ago. Owen, she said. Yes. I love you. Aunt Nell. I'm not coming to Providence. She hung up before he could argue. The farmhouse was worse than it had looked in the photographs. The floors sloped toward the middle of the kitchen. The wallpaper in the front parlor was peeling in long yellow strips. The stairs creaked. The pipes rattled. And somewhere in the walls, something was living. Eleanor could hear it at night, scratching, running, settling in. She didn't care. She unpacked one suitcase. She put Arthur's ashes on the mantel in the parlor. In the small oak box she had carried in her lap the entire drive from Boston. She put Clara's photograph next to the ashes. The photograph was the last one ever taken. Clara had been 18. She had just finished her first year of college. She was standing on the porch of the Boston house wearing a yellow sweater and holding a coffee mug shaped like a cat. She was laughing at something Arthur had said just outside the frame. She would be dead in 6 weeks. Eleanor placed the photograph carefully next to Arthur's ashes. She straightened the frame. She stepped back. Well, she said to the empty room. Here we are. The house did not answer. She spent the first 3 weeks working on the house. She patched what she could patch. She scrubbed what she could scrub. She threw away 3 generations of newspapers and mason jars and moth-eaten quilts. She hired a man from town to look at the roof, and another man to look at the well, and a third man to tell her the septic was on its last legs. She was learning to be gentle with things. It was not something that came naturally. Arthur had been the gentle one. She was still learning. On the 23rd day, she walked down to the Southern 40 for the first time since the closing. The rain had finally stopped. The water in the swamp had risen almost to the tree line. Alder and willow, and the black skeletons of things that had died standing up. Reeds swaying in a wind she couldn't feel down at ground level. Eleanor stood at the edge of the water and looked out across it. And that was when she saw the first one. She thought it was a fallen tree. That was the reasonable explanation. Swamps had fallen trees. Old ones. Rotted ones. Half submerged and slowly returning to whatever they had come from. But this one was too straight. That was the thing that stopped her. She squinted. She took a step closer. She wiped the rain off her glasses with the corner of her jacket. Too straight. Too long. And beside it, another one. Almost parallel. And beyond that, a third. Also parallel. All of them pointing roughly in the same direction. Like they had been laid down on purpose. Like someone had arranged them. She walked back to the barn. She came back with a metal rod she had found in one of the sheds. 6 feet long. Old. She stepped into the water. Cold. Colder than she had expected. Came up over her boots almost immediately. She could feel the mud sucking at her heels. She pushed the rod down. Nothing. She moved 5 feet to the left. Pushed again. Thunk. Wood. She pulled the rod out. Moved another 5 feet. Pushed. Thunk. Wood. She moved again. And again. And again. Thunk. 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 She lost track of time. She went back to the house. She dug through a box of surveying flags left by one of the previous owners. Orange plastic on thin wire stakes. She carried them back to the swamp. She started marking the spots. 2 hours later, she stood at the edge of the water and counted. 23 orange flags, standing among the reeds, bright as fire against the black water. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered through the parlor in her nightgown. Her hand went to the roll-top desk that had come with the house. She had been meaning to clean it out. She pulled open the middle drawer. Something crinkled under her fingers. A folded piece of paper, yellowed, brittle at the edges. She unfolded it carefully. A hand-drawn map, dated 1952, in careful pencil at the corner. The southern 40 acres of the property. And across the swamp, in the same careful handwriting, 3 words. Don't dig. Leave it. Signed with 2 initials. T. B. Eleanor sat down slowly in the wingback chair. She read the note again. She looked at the piece of white oak she had cut that afternoon, sitting on the kitchen table under the yellow light. Well, she whispered. Somebody knew. The name of the man in the woods came to her at the diner in town. She had been eating pancakes and half listening to 2 farmers at the counter argue about the price of hay. She had a piece of clean white oak in her jacket pocket. She kept touching it, making sure it was still there. You'd have to ask old Ainsworth, one of the farmers said. Eleanor looked up. Silas doesn't talk to anybody, the other farmer said. He'd know though. Man's been in wood his whole life. His whole life he's been drunk. That was years ago, was it? He's just old now. The 2 men laughed. Eleanor set down her fork. Excuse me, who is Silas Ainsworth? The first farmer looked at her, then at the second farmer, then back at her. Ma'am, you don't want to go see Silas Ainsworth. Why not? He doesn't like people. That's fine. I don't like most people either. The second farmer laughed out loud. He lives out past the ridge, the first farmer said finally. Old cabin. Blue door. Only house on that stretch of road. Can't miss it. Thank you. She paid her bill. She left a good tip. She drove out past the ridge to a cabin with a blue door. She knocked. Nobody answered. She knocked again. The door opened. The man in the doorway was tall. Even at 74 he was still tall. Broad shoulders that had probably been broader once. Hands like something carved out of the same oak he'd spent his life cutting. White hair that hadn't been cut in a long time. Beard the same. Eyes so pale a blue they looked almost gray in the shadow of the doorway. No, he said. Excuse me. Whatever you're selling. No. He started to close the door. Eleanor reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out the piece of wood. She held it up. Do you know what this is? Silas Ainsworth froze. The door stopped closing. He stared at the piece of wood in her hand. His face did not change. But something behind his eyes did. Some shift. Some crack. Some door opening in a house that had been sealed shut for a very long time. He looked up at her. Where? He said. His voice was rough. Where did you get that? Under my farm. Under a swamp. On my farm. There are more. How many more? I don't know yet. Hundreds, maybe. He kept staring at the wood. Lady, he said, you don't know what you're holding. Then tell me. His jaw worked. That's white oak. Old-growth white oak. That kind of tree. In this valley. It hasn't grown here in over 120 years. Nobody living has ever seen a tree that big cut down in this county. That kind of wood is gone. He paused. It's supposed to be gone. Eleanor stood very still on his porch. How much of it? Silas asked. Maybe 1,000. Maybe more. 1,000. Silas Ainsworth looked at her for a very long moment. Then he closed the door. Not slammed it. Just closed it. Softly. With the care of a man who was trying very hard not to fall apart in front of a stranger. Franklin Prescott came to visit on a Tuesday. He drove a black pickup truck. Too clean for a man who claimed to run a lumber business. He wore a wool coat with a fur collar that was probably real. He had the kind of handshake that made you feel like he had already decided what you were worth. Eleanor did not like him. She did not like him before he opened his mouth. She did not like him more after. Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Prescott. I heard there was a new owner up at the old Baxter place. Word travels fast. Small town. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had smiled his way through a lot of rooms. Practiced, even. It didn't reach his eyes. I run Prescott Timber, he said. Family business. Been around 120 years. Maybe more. Is that so? We're always looking for good land. The southern portion of your property. It's not doing you any favors, is it? How much would you offer? He named a number. It was low. The kind of low that told her he thought he was talking to an old woman from the city who didn't know what her own property was worth. Eleanor thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. No, she said. Franklin's smile flickered. Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Prescott. You haven't even considered it. I have. For 4 seconds. That was 3 seconds longer than it needed. The smile disappeared entirely. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in the conversation, he stopped seeing an old woman and started seeing whatever it was that Eleanor Whitfield actually was. Well, he said finally. I hope you'll think about it. I already have. Have a nice day, Mrs. Whitfield. You too, Mr. Prescott. He turned. He walked back to his black truck. He drove away. Eleanor stood on the porch until the sound of his tires faded down the gravel road. Then she went back inside. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee. And then, very quietly, she said out loud, to no one in particular, what on earth is under that swamp? She rented a small winch from the equipment yard in the next town over. She read the manual twice. She practiced with it in her driveway on a stump she wanted to remove. Took her 4 hours to get the stump out. But the stump was out, and she had learned how to operate the winch. October was cold that year. The first hard frost came on the 3rd of the month. Eleanor woke up to fields silvered with it. She put on 2 pairs of socks and Arthur's old barn coat that she had refused to throw away. Arthur's coat still smelled like him. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe she just remembered the smell so clearly that her brain filled it in whenever she put the coat on. Either way, she wore it. At 6:17 in the morning, she was standing ankle-deep in black swamp water, one hand wrapped around the control of the rented winch, watching the steel cable tighten around the log she had chosen. She pressed the switch. The cable tightened. It hummed like something alive. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the mud moved. A line of bubbles broke the surface 20 yards away. Reeds leaned sideways. The winch groaned. The cable strained. Slowly, so slowly, something began to rise from the black water. First an inch, then 2, then a foot, then the entire top curve of a massive trunk emerging from the mud like the back of a whale surfacing in the sea. Eleanor could feel her pulse in her throat. By the time the entire thing lay beside the water, Eleanor could barely believe what she was looking at. It was nearly 3 feet across. There was no bark, no branches, no roots, just a long, straight trunk stained almost completely black. But when she knelt down at one end and scraped away the mud with her gloved hand, she saw something that stopped her breath. The end was flat, not broken, not snapped, not chewed away by rot. Flat. Someone had cut this. Someone had felled this tree a very long time ago. She sat back on her heels in the freezing mud. Oh, she said softly. Oh my. She brought the chainsaw out that afternoon. The chain touched the black surface. Dark fragments sprayed outward across her boots. For the first inch, she saw exactly what she expected. Stained wood, softened material, mud. Then the sound changed. She eased off the throttle. She looked down. A streak of warm brown ran through the black debris around her boots. She cut another inch. More warm brown. Then a flash of something almost pale, almost gold. She shut off the saw. Silence returned to the swamp. She pressed the point of her pocketknife into the fresh cut. It didn't sink through. It didn't crumble. It was solid. The outside of this log looked like it had been rotting for 100 years. But the inside was wood. Real wood. Tight, dense, well preserved with the color of clover honey. Eleanor Whitfield sat down on the log. Just sat there, for a very long time. Then she got up. She went to the house. She sat down at the kitchen table. And she called Silas Ainsworth. She waited 3 rings. He picked up. Ainsworth. Silas. It's Mrs. Whitfield. Long silence. I cut into one of the logs. Longer silence. The inside is gold, Silas. She heard him breathe. She heard him swallow. Then she heard him say something she did not expect. I'll come tomorrow. The break-in happened 4 nights later. She woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of glass breaking. She did not scream. She did not run. She got out of bed. She picked up the fireplace poker she had brought upstairs 3 nights ago just in case. She walked to the top of the stairs. She listened. Whoever it was had come in through the kitchen window. She could hear them, just for a moment, the scrape of boots on the linoleum, a muffled cough, then nothing, then the sound of the kitchen door opening and closing, then a truck starting in the distance, then silence. Eleanor went downstairs. The window was broken, glass on the floor, nothing else touched, nothing taken. But on the kitchen table, held down by the salt shaker, was a piece of lined paper. For words, written in careful block letters. This land isn't yours. Eleanor stared at it. She sat down at the kitchen table. She set the fireplace poker across her lap. She looked at the piece of wood she had left there yesterday. The little disc of white oak, sitting exactly where the intruder had placed the note. She should have been afraid. Any reasonable person would have been afraid. She was not. She was something else. Something old. Something she hadn't felt in 30 years. She was angry. She picked up the note. She read it again. This land isn't yours. Yes, it is, she said out loud to nobody. Yes, it is. She folded the note. She put it in her pocket. She did not call the police. She had a pretty good idea who had done it. And she was going to handle it herself. She went to the barn the next morning at dawn. She stood in front of the old walnut workbench Arthur had bought her one anniversary, long before everything, when they had still believed that life was a thing that unfolded predictably. She placed her hand on the workbench. She spoke to her husband, who had been dead for 2 years. Arthur, she said, I think I need to stay. The workbench did not answer. But somewhere, deep in the frozen ground of the southern 40 acres, 1,700 logs waited under black water for a woman brave enough to pull them out. Silas Ainsworth arrived at Eleanor's farm on a Tuesday. She was in the barn when she heard the truck. An old Chevy, rust along the wheel wells, the kind of engine that had been rebuilt more times than most marriages last. She stepped outside. He didn't get out at first. He just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, looking at the barn, looking at the house, looking at everything except her. Then he opened the door. He walked around to the back of the truck. He lifted out a wooden toolbox, old, hand-built, the kind of thing you couldn't buy in a store because nobody made them like that anymore. He carried it toward her. He set it down at her feet. If you're going to do this, he said, you're going to do it right. That was it. That was the whole conversation. She didn't ask what changed his mind. He didn't offer. She just nodded. And he just nodded back. And then he walked past her into the barn like he'd been walking into that barn every morning for 40 years. Eleanor stood there for a moment. Then she followed him. They started at the western edge. Silas walked ahead with a long steel probe. Eleanor came behind with the notebook. He would push the probe down. He would grunt when it hit wood. She would mark the spot with an orange flag. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Silas moved through the swamp like a man who had been born knowing exactly how to move through swamps. By the end of the first day, they had marked 43 new flags. By the end of the first week, over 200. By the end of 3 weeks, they had passed 400. The swamp was giving up its secrets. Slowly, one log at a time. On the 9th day, Silas started talking. Not about wood. About his wife. They were sitting on the tailgate of his truck at the end of a long afternoon. Eleanor was drinking coffee from a thermos. Silas was drinking coffee from a chipped enamel mug he had brought from home. The sun was going down behind the pines, and the light was that particular kind of gold you only get in October in New England. Her name was Ida, he said. Eleanor looked at him. He didn't look back. He was looking at the swamp. Died in 1992. Cancer. The kind that eats you slow. I'm sorry. Long time ago now. He took a sip of his coffee. We had one daughter, Meredith. She was 13 when Ida passed. She left home 20 years ago. I said something I shouldn't have said. She said something back. Then we both said things. And then she was gone. He paused. I don't know where she lives. I don't know if she's married. I don't know if I have grandchildren. Eleanor set down her thermos. Silas. Yes. Have you tried to find her? No. Why? Because. He stopped. He took another sip of coffee. Because I don't know what I would say. Eleanor understood that. She understood that better than anyone in the world. Because there were things she had never said to Clara. Things she had been going to say. Things she had been waiting for the right moment to say. And then everything ended. And after that, every single day for 30 years, she had walked around with a mouthful of words that would never be spoken to the person they were meant for. She reached over. She put her hand on Silas Ainsworth's forearm. She didn't say anything. He didn't move. They sat there like that. Two old people. On a tailgate, in October, not looking at each other, not saying anything, just breathing the same cold air. The next morning, she told him about Clara. She had never told anyone about Clara. Not really. Not the whole thing. Arthur had lived it with her. He had been there. Arthur wasn't someone she had told. Arthur was someone she had survived it with. But Silas she had known for 9 days. And she told him everything. She told him about the yellow sweater. She told him about the cat mug. She told him about the drunk driver and the wet road and the phone call at 3 in the morning. She told him that she had been the one who answered it. She had been on shift. She had taken the call at the nurse's station. She had heard the voice of a state trooper who couldn't quite get the words out in the right order. Ma'am, there's been your daughter. Ma'am. She had walked out of the emergency room. She had gotten in her car. She had driven to the hospital where they had taken Clara. She had stood there for a very long time, not touching her, not crying, just looking. She had already known. Mothers know. She told him about the 20 years she couldn't step foot in Clara's bedroom because she couldn't bear to change anything. She told him about the day she finally did step in, and how she had sat on the floor of that bedroom for 6 hours, and how Arthur had found her there when he came home from teaching, and how he had sat down beside her, and how neither of them had said a single word. Silas listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix anything. He just listened. When she was done, he said one thing. Nell. Nobody had called her Nell in 2 years. Arthur had called her Nell. Yes. Thank you. She started crying then. Just a little. Just enough. And Silas didn't try to stop her. He didn't offer her a handkerchief. He just sat there with her, which was, it turned out, exactly what she needed. She went to see Prudence Halloway on a Saturday. Prudence lived in a small blue house on the edge of town. She was 85 years old. She had lived in that house for 62 of them. Her husband had been the town's dentist. Her son had been the town's mayor. She knew everything about everyone, and she remembered stories that nobody else was old enough to remember. Eleanor had been told about her by the woman at the post office. If it's history you want, the woman had said, you want Prudence Halloway. So Eleanor went. She brought a jar of blueberry preserves from the farm stand on Route 7. They sat in the parlor. Prudence poured tea. "Now," she said, "what do you want to know?" Eleanor did not waste time. "The swamp. On my property. What's the story?" Prudence set down the teapot. Her hands were very steady for a woman of 85. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "How much time do you have?" "All afternoon." "Good." She settled back into her chair, and she began. "There was a logging camp there. Not on your farm. Just upstream. On the ridge where the pines are now. This would have been 1890, maybe 91. Before I was born, of course. But my grandmother worked in the kitchen at the boarding house in town, and she remembered them coming in." Eleanor sipped her tea. She did not interrupt. "They were Irish. Most of them. Fresh off the boat. They had come up from Boston looking for work. There were 4 families that ran the operation together. Doyle, Fitzpatrick, Marr, and Ainsworth." Eleanor set down her teacup. Prudence noticed. Prudence noticed everything. "You know Silas?" "Yes." "Then you know." "I know his last name is Ainsworth." "Then you know." Prudence continued. "They cut white oak. Old growth. The kind that had been standing in these hills since before Columbus. Trees so big it took 3 men to reach around them. Trees that would build the finest furniture in America if you could get them to market. And they could, because the river came right through the valley. They would fell the trees. They would drag them to the water. They would build rafts. And every spring, when the water was high, they would float those rafts down to the mills in Massachusetts. And then a man named Prescott decided he wanted the market for himself. Eleanor felt something cold move through her chest. His name was Cornelius Prescott. He owned the big mill downstream. He had been buying up timber rights across 3 counties. But the Irish wouldn't sell. They were doing well. They were sending money home to Ireland. And Cornelius Prescott did not like competition. So what did he do? Prudence looked at her. He killed them. Eleanor did not move. Not directly, not with his own hands, but he had men. And one night in the spring of 1897, during the flood, someone opened the retention gates on the upper dam. All at once. In the middle of the night, the rafts that were staged for the run downstream got hit with a wall of water, broke apart, scattered. Half the men on those rafts went into the river with the logs. 11 bodies were pulled out over the next week. 6 were never found. Prudence paused. The Ainsworth patriarch was one of the 11. His name was Cormac, Silas's great-grandfather. He left a wife and 4 children. Eleanor closed her eyes. Within 2 years, all 4 families were gone. Some went back to Ireland. Some went to New York. Some drank themselves to death in the boarding houses of Boston. And Cornelius Prescott bought their timber rights for pennies, made a fortune, died an old man in a big house in Burlington. Everyone in the county came to the funeral. And the logs. Prudence smiled. It was not a nice smile. That's the part nobody ever talks about. The finest cut of white oak in the whole valley, enough to build 100 houses, went into the river during that flood. And most of them sank. Right into the low ground. Right into the marsh. Right into the acreage that eventually got called worthless swampland. Eleanor felt her hands go cold. They've been there for 128 years. Under my farm. Yes, and Silas doesn't know his family owned some of those logs. But his father knew. And his grandfather knew. And they never spoke of it. Because the pain of it was too big. And because the Prescotts still ran the county. Prudence. Yes, dear. The Prescotts. They still own Prescott Timber. Yes, they do. And the man running it now. Cornelius Prescott's great-great-grandson. Franklin. Eleanor set down her tea. Her hand was shaking. Just a little. Prudence reached across the small table. She put her wrinkled hand over Eleanor's. Dear, that man came to your door, didn't he? Wanted to buy your swamp. Cash offer. No paperwork. Yes. Well, now you know why. Prudence paused. There's one more thing. The Prescott family. They've had their own troubles keeping the name together. Franklin has a sister, Vivian. She left the family a long time ago. Nobody's seen her in years. Word is she was the only decent one in the bunch. Eleanor tucked the name away in her memory. She did not know why. Not yet. Eleanor drove home in a daze. She got home. She sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. Then she went inside. Then she picked up the phone. Then she called Silas. Come to the house. When? Now. He came. She poured them both a glass of the whiskey Arthur had kept in the cupboard above the refrigerator. She had never touched it in the 2 years since he died. She poured them each 2 fingers. She sat down across from Silas at the kitchen table. She told him everything. She watched his face while she talked. She watched it not change. Not once. Not through the story of Cornelius Prescott. Not through the story of the dam. Not through the story of the 11 bodies pulled out of the river. Not until she said the name, Cormac Ainsworth. Then his face changed. Then his whole face changed. He set the whiskey glass down very slowly. He put both hands flat on the kitchen table. He stared at his own hands for a very long time. Then he stood up. Silas, I need to go. Silas, I need to go home. He walked out of the kitchen. He walked out of the house. He got in his truck. He drove away. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched his taillights disappear down the gravel road. She whispered his name into the dark. He did not come back that night. Franklin Prescott's next move came 3 days later. It came in the form of a very expensive lawyer. A woman in her 40s. Charcoal suit. Sensible heels. A briefcase that cost more than Eleanor's monthly grocery budget. She parked a silver sedan in the driveway. She rang the doorbell. She introduced herself as Ms. Delaney of Delaney and Whitmore, out of Burlington. The concerned party had reason to believe that Mrs. Whitfield was engaged in unlicensed extraction operations on federally protected wetlands. Ms. Delaney handed her a manila envelope. She said the words cease and desist. She said the words civil action. Eleanor listened. She did not interrupt. When Ms. Delaney was finished, Eleanor took the manila envelope. She held it in her hands. Have a good afternoon. You too. Eleanor closed the door. She stood in the front hall. She looked at the envelope. She walked to the kitchen. She dropped it on the table. She sat down. She put her head in her hands. Then the phone rang. The bank. They were calling about the equipment loan she had taken out. The loan officer's voice was very polite. They would need to accelerate the repayment schedule. He was very sorry. How long? 30 days. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen. She stared at the wall. Then she started to laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was the only sound her body could make. That wasn't screaming. She should have slowed down. She knew she should have slowed down. Silas had told her. The wood has been asleep for 100 years. You wake it up too fast, it falls apart. But Silas wasn't at the farm anymore. Silas had been gone for 4 days. And the bank had given her 30, so she started pulling logs. She pulled 12 in the first week, then 15 the next. By the end of the second week, 27 black trunks lay in a row along the edge of the field like massive sleeping animals. 3 days after the 27th log came out, she heard the first crack. Sharp, sudden, loud. She walked out to the edge of the field. She saw it. A long fracture running down the length of the largest trunk. From the exposed end, deep into the wood. By afternoon, another one had cracked. By nightfall, 3 more. By morning of the next day, 6 of the 27 logs had visible damage. Eleanor sat down on a stump. She looked at her ruined wood. She thought about 128 years. She thought about 11 bodies in a river. She put her face in her hands. And for the first time since Arthur died, she cried until she couldn't breathe. The storm came on Thursday. Not a normal storm. The kind of storm that has a name by the time it hits the coast. Wind that stripped the last of the leaves off the maples in one afternoon. Rain sideways. Trees down across power lines, from Rutland to the Canadian border. Eleanor spent the whole night in the parlor. She had candles. She had a battery lantern. She had Arthur's coat wrapped around her shoulders. She sat in the wingback chair facing the window and watched the wind do its work. Around 3 in the morning, she heard a sound from the direction of the swamp, a wrenching, a snapping. She grabbed the lantern. She put on her boots. She went out into the storm. The rain hit her like small stones. The wind almost took the lantern out of her hand. She stumbled through the pasture in the dark, her old body protesting every step. She got to the edge of the swamp. She lifted the lantern. The winch was on its side. The cable was cut. Not broken. Cut. Someone had come out here, in the storm, and cut the cable, and pushed the winch over. Eleanor stood in the rain. She whispered, "I can't do this." The swamp did not answer. "I can't." The wind took her voice. "Arthur," she said. "Arthur, I can't." She walked back to the house. She dripped water across the parlor floor. She sat down in the wingback chair. She wrapped Arthur's coat tighter. She closed her eyes, and she thought about Providence, about Owen's guest room, about giving up. She sat there until the sun came up. Owen was on her porch at 7. She had not called him. He was just there, wet, cold, wearing a jacket he had pulled on over pajamas, his hair a mess, his eyes red from driving through the night. "Aunt Nell." "Owen, I heard about the storm. You drove here." "I drove here, from Providence." She opened the door. He walked in. He stood in the front hall dripping onto the rug. He looked at her. He looked at the wet clothes she was still wearing from the night before. "What happened?" She told him. Everything. The intruder. The note. The lawyer. The bank. The 27 logs. The cracking. The storm. The winch. The cable. She told him about Prudence. About Cornelius Prescott. About Cormac Ainsworth. She told him about Silas walking away 4 days ago and not coming back. She told him she couldn't do it anymore. She told him she was thinking about selling. She told him she was thinking about Providence. Owen sat down at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up. "Where are your work gloves?" "Owen." "Aunt Nell. You have a job." "I called out." "You called out from Providence." "I called out from Providence." "Where are your work gloves?" "In the mudroom." He walked to the mudroom. He came back wearing her spare pair of work gloves and Arthur's other coat. "Come on, Owen. We are going to fix the winch. And then we are going to figure out what to do about the lawyer, and the bank, and Franklin Prescott, and Silas. But right now, we are going to fix the winch." Eleanor looked at her nephew, the boy she had held at his baptism, the boy who had grown up spending summers at her house in Boston, the boy who had grown into a man who worried too much about his aunt, the boy who had driven 6 hours through a storm in his pajamas. She started crying again. Owen came over. He put his arms around her. He didn't say anything. He just held her. Then he said, "Show me the logs." She showed him. They walked out through the pasture together in the cold gray light after the storm. He walked beside her. He didn't rush her. He didn't ask questions. They got to the edge of the swamp. They stood there together. Owen looked at the 27 logs. He looked at the cracked ones. He looked at the ones that were still whole. He put his hands on his hips. He looked at the water. "Aunt Nell." "Yes, that's incredible." She looked at him. She had not thought about it that way. She had thought about it as a burden, as a problem, as something that was going to bankrupt her, as something that was making her enemies. She had not thought about it as incredible. But standing there, next to her nephew, with the sun starting to come through the broken clouds, she looked at the swamp again, and it was incredible. She had almost forgotten. They worked all day. Owen was not a handyman. He had spent his entire adult life sitting at desks, moving numbers on spreadsheets. But he had YouTube on his phone. And he had determination. And he had 6 years of watching Arthur repair things around the Boston apartment when he was a boy. By 4 in the afternoon, the winch was upright again. The cable was replaced. The generator that powered the small pump was running. Eleanor stood in the pasture. She watched her nephew, covered in mud, from head to foot, drink a bottle of water she had brought him. He grinned at her. See what? You needed help. I did. You should have called me. I know. You should always call me Aunt Nell. I know. He laughed. She laughed too. It was the first time she had laughed since October. They were pulling a log that evening. Not a big one. Just testing the repaired equipment. Something to end the day on. The trunk came up slowly. Owen was watching the cable. Eleanor was working the control. Halfway out, Owen said, "Aunt Nell, stop." She stopped. He was leaning in close to the trunk, wiping mud away with his gloved hand. Wiping, then very still. "Aunt Nell, what?" "Come look." She walked over. She knelt in the mud. She saw what he was looking at. Cut into the wood, deep into the surface, deep enough that 128 years of swamp water hadn't been able to erase it. A 3-leaf clover. And underneath, 2 letters. C-A. Eleanor stared at the marking. Her breath caught in her chest. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Silas Ainsworth was standing at the edge of the swamp. She had not heard his truck. She had not heard him walk up. But he was here now. His face was very still. His eyes were on the log, on the clover, on the letters C-A. He walked forward slowly. He walked past her, past Owen, right up to the trunk. He got down on his knees in the black mud. He put his hand on the wood. He put his forehead against the wood. And Silas Ainsworth, 74 years old, a man who had not cried in 20 years, cried like a child. Cried for a great-grandfather he had never met. Cried for a family that had never gotten to bury their dead. Cried for 128 years of silence. Eleanor knelt down beside him. She put her hand on his back. Owen stood behind them, silent. Nobody spoke. The last light of the day slid across the water. Eleanor Whitfield closed her eyes. She was not going to sell this farm. She was not going to Providence. She was not going anywhere. Because the swamp had been waiting for someone. And now it had 3. Owen quit his job on a Monday. He didn't call to discuss it. He just called Eleanor from his apartment in Providence one morning and said, "Aunt Nell, yes, I did it." "Did what?" "Quit. Owen. I'm coming up, Owen. For good." She was quiet for a long time. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Aunt Nell." "Yes. I have never been more sure of anything in my life." She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at the piece of white oak she had cut from the very first log. It was sitting in the middle of the table now, sanded, oiled, the color of dark honey. She used it as a coaster for her morning coffee. She said, "Your bedroom is ready." Owen laughed. "I love you, Aunt Nell. I love you too." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. Then she got up. She walked out to the barn. She found Silas at the workbench. She said, "Owen is coming." Silas nodded. He did not stop working. But his hands changed. Just slightly. There was a lightness to them now. He said, "Good." Then, after a moment quieter, "I'll cook something when he gets here." Eleanor looked up. "You cook?" "Some. Ida taught me. Before." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eleanor smiled at his back. She walked out of the barn into the morning. They built a system. Slowly. Carefully. One decision at a time. Silas taught Owen how to read a log. How to know, before you pulled it, whether the wood inside was going to be worth the trouble. How to move a trunk without cracking it. How to score the end grain to slow the drying. How to stack lumber with spacers so air could move through the pile like breath through a chest. Owen was a fast learner. Not because he was gifted with his hands. He wasn't. He was an insurance man from Providence who had never operated anything more complicated than a coffee maker until he was 28 years old. But he was patient, and he was watching, and he was, Eleanor realized one morning, watching Silas the way a son watches a father. She did not say anything about it. Not to Owen. Not to Silas. Not to anyone. Some things you don't name. Some things you just let happen. The winter was hard. Vermont winters always are. But this one was harder because they had to keep working. The logs that had come out couldn't wait. The stacks had to be turned. The barn had to be heated just enough to keep the wood from freezing, but not so much that it dried too fast. And underneath all of it, the bank, the lawyer, the threat. Ms. Delaney sent another letter in December, and another in January, each one thicker than the last. Eleanor did not respond to any of them. Silas said, "You should get a lawyer." Owen said, "You need a lawyer." Eleanor said, "I know a lawyer." She called an old friend of Arthur's, a woman named Beatrice Kavanaugh, who had been a public defender in Boston for 30 years, and had retired 3 years ago to a farm outside Middlebury. Arthur had been Beatrice's history teacher. Beatrice had never forgotten. Eleanor drove to Middlebury on a Tuesday. She sat in Beatrice's kitchen for 4 hours. She showed her every letter. She told her the whole story. Beatrice listened. When Eleanor was done, Beatrice poured them both another cup of coffee. She said, "Eleanor, yes, they have nothing. They have lawyers. They have expensive lawyers who are sending you scary letters. That is not the same as having something." Beatrice, "Yes, I can't pay you what you're worth." Beatrice smiled. She patted Eleanor's hand. "Honey," she said, "you already paid me 38 years ago, when your husband walked into my sophomore history class and made me believe that a girl from a mill town could be anything she wanted to be." Eleanor started to cry. Beatrice let her. Then Beatrice said, "Now, let's write a letter." They wrote it that afternoon. It went to Ms. Delaney at Delaney and Whitmore. It was very short. It said that Mrs. Whitfield was in full compliance with all applicable state and federal statutes. It said that the timber being recovered was of pre-1900 provenance. It said that any further correspondence would be treated as harassment. It was signed Beatrice Kavanaugh. ESQ. They never heard from Ms. Delaney again. But Franklin Prescott was not done. Franklin Prescott was never going to be done. Because Franklin Prescott had grown up in a house where his father had told him and his grandfather had told his father that the Prescott name was the most important thing in the world, and that anything that threatened the Prescott name had to be crushed. Franklin Prescott was, Eleanor was slowly coming to understand, a very lonely man. But she did not feel sorry for him. Not yet. In February he showed up at the farm himself. He came alone. He drove his black pickup. He knocked on the kitchen door like an old friend stopping by for coffee. Eleanor opened it. She did not invite him in. "Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Prescott. May I come in?" "No." He smiled. The smile was different now. Thinner. Tighter. "I came to make one final offer." "Final?" "Yes." "Then say it." $500,000. Eleanor did not react. She just looked at him. "For the wetland acreage. And every log currently on your property. Milled or unmilled. Wet or dry. Everything. 500,000. Cash. In your account by the end of the week." She waited. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Yes. Do you understand what I'm offering you?" "I understand exactly what you're offering me." "Then." "No." "Mrs. Whitfield." "No." Franklin Prescott took a breath. She could see him trying to keep his composure, the muscle in his jaw. This was the first time in his life that someone had ever told him no twice in a row, and meant it. "May I ask why?" "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. She pulled Arthur's coat around her shoulders. She said, "Mr. Prescott, you're not trying to buy wood." He didn't answer. "You're trying to buy silence. And silence isn't for sale." He stared at her. "There are things," she said, "that should never have a price." He stared at her for another long moment. Then he turned. He walked back to his truck. He got in. He drove away. She watched him go. She thought, that is a man who has lost. She thought, and he doesn't know it yet. The article came out in April. They had worked on it for 3 months. Eleanor, Silas, Owen, and a young reporter named Cass Whitmore, from a small independent paper based out of Montpelier. Cass was 31 years old, wore round glasses, drove a car that was mostly held together with tape. She had grown up in a mill town in Maine. She understood, without being told, exactly what this story was. Cass spent weeks in the barn. She spent weeks in the archives. She spent weeks with Prudence Halloway going through old letters, old land deeds, old ship manifests from the 1890s. She tracked down descendants of the 4 Irish families. The Doyles, the Fitzpatricks, the Marrs, the Ainsworths. Some had moved back to Ireland. Some had stayed in America. All of them, when contacted, knew the family story. All of them had lived under the shadow of a great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather who had died in a river in 1897. None of them had ever spoken about it publicly, because they had been raised to believe that no one would listen. Cass Whitmore listened. Cass Whitmore wrote it all down. The article was 6,000 words long. It ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. It included photographs of Cormac Ainsworth's mark on the recovered log. Photographs of Silas standing in the barn holding a piece of white oak the color of dark honey. Photographs of Eleanor in Arthur's coat, standing at the edge of the swamp. The headline read, "The Forest Beneath the Mud." The article was picked up. Not everywhere, but it was picked up by 2 regional papers. Then by an NPR affiliate in Burlington. Then by a segment on Vermont public television. Then a woman named Aisling Doyle, 68 years old, retired librarian from Poughkeepsie, saw the story on the news at her sister's house. Aisling Doyle called Cass Whitmore. Aisling Doyle said, "My great-grandfather was one of the men in your article." Cass drove to Poughkeepsie. Aisling brought out a wooden box she had inherited from her mother. Inside the box was a bundle of letters, written in 1896 and 1897, written by her great-grandfather to his wife back in County Cork. The letters described the operation on the ridge. The letters described the men. The last letter was dated March 11th, 1897. Aisling's great-grandfather had drowned 5 weeks later. He had been 34 years old. Cass wrote a second article, then a third, then a fourth. By the end of June, there had been 12 descendants who came forward. 12 families. 12 names. And in Burlington, in the big house that had once belonged to Cornelius Prescott, the great-great-grandson Franklin Prescott was watching his phone ring. And ring. And ring. The person who came to Eleanor's door in July was not Franklin. She was a small woman in her 50s. Iron gray hair cut short. A face that had once been very beautiful and was still striking in a hard, sharp way. She wore no makeup. She carried a leather satchel that had seen a lot of use. She said, "Mrs. Whitfield." "Yes. My name is Vivian Prescott." Eleanor did not react, but she remembered. She remembered Prudence saying the name. "Franklin has a sister, the only decent one in the bunch." "I'm Franklin's sister," Vivian said. "I see. May I come in?" Eleanor considered her for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "Yes." Vivian Prescott sat at the kitchen table. She refused coffee. She refused tea. She placed the leather satchel on the table. She said, "I've been reading Miss Whitmore's articles." Eleanor said nothing. "I want to tell you something about my family. My father was a monster. My grandfather was a monster. My great-grandfather was a monster. And I have every reason to believe that my great-great-grandfather Cornelius was worse than all of them combined." Eleanor kept her face very still. "I left the family business 22 years ago. I have not spoken to my brother in 11 years. I do not use the Prescott money. I teach 8th grade English in a public school in Concord, Massachusetts. Vivian opened the satchel. She took out a small book, bound in dark leather, worn at the corners. Old. She slid it across the table toward Eleanor. "This," she said, "is my great-great-grandfather's personal journal. From 1896 to 1902, I have had it in my possession for 11 years. Since my father died, I took it out of his safe. I have never showed it to anyone." Eleanor did not touch it. She looked at Vivian. "Why now?" "Because." Vivian paused. She looked at the wall. Then she looked back at Eleanor. "Because a woman I have never met bought 40 acres of swamp in Vermont and refused to be quiet. And because those 12 families deserve to know what happened. And because I have carried this book on my conscience for 11 years, and I am tired." Eleanor looked at the journal. "What does it say?" "Everything. He wrote everything down. What he ordered, who he paid, the names of the men who opened the retention gates, the names of the men who died. He kept a list of the drowned, like a hunter keeping a list of kills." Eleanor closed her eyes. He wasn't ashamed. He was proud. Eleanor opened her eyes. She reached out. She touched the journal. She did not open it. "Vivian." "Yes. Are you sure?" Vivian Prescott smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was a real one. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I have never been more sure of anything in my life. The journal was published as a public archive. Not sold. Not licensed. Not turned into a book that Eleanor could make money from. Just given." Beatrice Kavanaugh helped them navigate the legal structure. Cass Whitmore worked with the State Historical Society to transcribe it. A university in Burlington agreed to host the digital version for free. The response was immediate. Prescott Timber lost its biggest contract in August. 2 others in September. By November, Franklin Prescott had announced his retirement. He sold the mill to a company from Maine. He moved out of the big house in Burlington. He did not, as far as anyone knew, go anywhere in particular. He just left, disappeared into whatever quiet corner of the world a man goes to when he has spent his entire life protecting a name that has finally collapsed under its own weight. Eleanor did not celebrate. She did not feel triumphant. She just felt tired and a little sorry. Not for Franklin. Franklin had made his choices, but for the boy Franklin might once have been. The boy who was born into a house full of secrets. Nobody is born a monster. She had learned that in her long career caring for the sick and the dying. She had also learned that once a person becomes one, forgiveness is not the same as absolution. They opened the workshop in the spring. They called it Clara and Cormac Woodworks. Eleanor's daughter and Silas's great-grandfather, together on the sign above the barn door, in letters that Owen had painted himself, with a very small brush and a very unsteady hand. The first table they sold was a farmhouse table, 10 feet long, live edge on both sides, the wood the color of old whiskey. It went to a woman in Connecticut who cried when she saw it delivered. The second was a bookshelf. The third was a mantel. Then a bed frame, then a set of dining chairs, then a bench for a chapel outside Bennington, then a cradle for a baby that hadn't been born yet. Every piece went with a card. The card told the story, where the wood had come from, who had cut it, when, why it had been lost, how it had been found again. People started calling, from farther and farther away. By summer they were shipping to 22 states. They were not rich. Silas would not let them charge what the wood was actually worth. He said the wood was not theirs to price. He said the wood belonged to the men who had cut it and to the families who had lost them. He said the money they made was enough. Enough for the farm. Enough for the workshop. Enough to send a small check every year to each of the 12 families, whose names had appeared in Cass Whitmore's articles. Enough was, Eleanor was learning, its own kind of wealth. The appraiser came in late September. He was a man from Boston. Tall, thin, white hair, 50 years in the specialty lumber business. He drove up in a station wagon that was older than Owen. He walked through the barn for the entire morning. He measured. He examined. He tested moisture. He grade sorted. At the end, he sat down at the kitchen table. Eleanor poured him coffee. He opened a small leather notebook. He said one number, $210,000. He said, "That's conservative. Wholesale. Not counting anything you might get for the story attached to it. For what's dried and gradable right now. Not counting the logs you haven't pulled yet." Eleanor looked at the number. She looked at the appraiser. She said, "Thank you." He nodded. He finished his coffee. He drove away. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a long time. $210,000. She had paid $168,000 for the entire farm. The wood already sitting in her barn was worth more than everything above the ground. She should have felt something big. She should have felt triumph. She felt something else. She felt grateful. She felt small. She felt like a woman who had been handed something that did not belong to her, and whose job was to hold it carefully, and eventually to give it away. Meredith Ainsworth came home in October. Nobody had contacted her. She had just seen the story. Somewhere. Some paper. Some link. Some article. Silas didn't ask. She didn't say. She drove up in a small blue car with California plates. She parked at the end of the gravel road. She got out. She stood there for a long time. Silas was on the porch of the small guest cabin that Owen had helped him fix up over the summer, the one he had moved into so he wouldn't have to keep driving 20 minutes home every night. He saw her. He did not move. She started walking toward him. Slowly, one step at a time. She got halfway across the yard. She stopped. She said, "Dad." He said nothing. She said, "I read the article." He said nothing. She said, "I don't know what to say." He said nothing. Then he said, "Come here." She walked the rest of the way. She did not run. She did not throw her arms around him. She stopped 3 feet from the porch. She looked at her father, 45 years old, 20 years since she had last seen him. She looked at him and she said, "Dad, I need time." Silas nodded. "But I'm here." Silas nodded again. He held out one hand. She stepped up onto the porch. She took the hand. They sat down together in the 2 rocking chairs Owen had put out there. They did not hug. They did not cry. They did not say very much of anything. But they sat together in the same silence they had been carrying for 20 years, but at least now they were carrying it in the same place. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window. She did not go outside. Some things are not for other people. Meredith stayed for a week. She did not move back. She had a life in California, a husband, a stepdaughter, a job as a physical therapist in a hospital outside Sacramento. But she stayed for a week, and she promised to come back at Christmas. And she called Silas every Sunday after she went home. Every Sunday, without fail. And every Sunday Silas sat at the workbench with the phone pressed to his ear, and he listened to his daughter's voice, and he answered her questions, and he asked her about the stepdaughter he had never met, and slowly, one Sunday at a time, he began to build back the thing that he had allowed to break 20 years earlier. Eleanor watched him become a father again. The way you watch someone come back from a long illness. Slowly, then all at once. The last log came out on a Saturday in October. 4 years and 1 month after the first. Log number 1700. They pulled it together. Eleanor, Silas, Owen. Meredith had flown in from California just for this. She stood on the bank of the swamp with a camera around her neck, taking pictures nobody had asked her to take. The log came up slowly. Eleanor was on the winch. Silas was on the cable. Owen was in the mud beside the log, guiding it with his gloved hands, watching for the twist, ready to stop everything if something went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The log slid up out of the black water. It moved across the disturbed ground. It came to rest at the edge of the pasture, next to the other logs, next to the pile of finished lumber, next to the workshop and the barn and everything that had grown up around this single strange endeavor over 4 years. Eleanor stopped the winch. She stood. She walked to the log. She knelt beside one end. She cleaned the mud with her hand. She saw the flat cut, the mark of a human hand. Someone in 1896 or 7 had swung an axe, had felled this tree, had marked it, had dragged it to the water, had never come back for it. Someone whose name they might never know. Eleanor closed her eyes. She said, quietly, "Thank you." Owen came over. He put his hand on her shoulder. Silas came over. He put his hand on her other shoulder. Meredith stood behind them, camera lowered, watching. For a long moment no one moved. Then Eleanor stood up. She looked at the swamp. There was still wood down there. She knew that. Silas knew that. Owen said, "Aunt Nell." "Yes. There's still more. I know. Do you want to keep going?" She looked at the black water, at the reeds that had already started to grow back over the tracks where they had worked, at the small channels the recovery had left, which the swamp was quietly, patiently filling in, at the pines beyond, at the sky. She said, "No." Owen looked at her. Silas said, "Nell." "Yes. You sure?" "I'm sure." She turned to look at all three of them. Her nephew, her friend's daughter. She said, "The swamp gave us enough." She said, "The rest belongs to it." Silas nodded. Owen said, "Okay." Meredith raised her camera. She took one last picture. They walked back to the house together. The sun was setting. The pasture was golden and long. Eleanor was in the middle. Silas on one side, Owen on the other, Meredith beside her father. For figures walking through a field that had once belonged to strangers. That evening Silas cooked. He made a beef stew with root vegetables from the garden. He made cornbread. He made a pie from apples off the tree in the front yard. Meredith set the table. Owen poured wine. Eleanor lit candles. They ate. They talked. They laughed. At one point Meredith told a story about her stepdaughter, who was 11, and had recently decided that she wanted to be a marine biologist. Silas laughed so hard that he had to set down his fork. Eleanor watched him laugh. She watched Owen watching him. She watched Meredith watching them both. She thought, "This is my family." She thought, "I did not know I could still have a family." She thought, "Arthur, do you see this? Clara, do you see this?" She thought they did. She thought wherever they were, they saw it. The kitchen table in the farmhouse was made from log number 1. The very first log Eleanor had pulled out of the swamp on that cold October morning at 6:17. Silas and Owen had built the table together over one whole winter. They had left the small crack in the corner. Silas had said, "That's where the world got in. You don't hide it, you keep it." A year after the last log came out, Eleanor opened a small school in the barn. Not a real school, a once-a-week thing, Saturday mornings. She invited any child from the town who wanted to come. She started with 4. By the end of the summer she had 11. By the end of the year she had 22. She did not teach them math. She did not teach them reading. She taught them how to look at things. She had a piece of white oak on the front table. Every child got to hold it. She would ask them, "What do you see?" They would say, "Wood." She would say, "Yes. What else?" They would say, "It's brown." She would say, "Yes. What else?" She would keep asking, gently, patiently, until one of the children looked closer, really looked, and started to see the rings, and started to count them, and started to understand that they were holding something that had been alive when their great-great-great-grandparents had been young. She taught them that the world was full of things nobody looked at. She taught them that the interesting things were almost always underneath. She taught them that being 67 or 72 or 78 did not mean you were done. She taught them that endings could be beginnings and beginnings could be endings, and mostly life was made up of both happening at the same time in the same body, without anyone telling you which was which. Silas helped her teach. Owen helped her teach. Meredith flew in twice a year and helped her teach. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table on a bright morning in June. She was 72 years old. She was drinking her morning coffee. She was watching the sun come through the kitchen window. On the wall in front of her hung 3 photographs. Clara in the yellow sweater holding the cat mug. Arthur standing in front of a class of students he had loved. And a small hand-painted sign, in careful letters. For the ones we never got to meet. Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the table. She placed her hand flat against the wood. She could feel it under her palm. Warm. Solid. 132 years old this year. She whispered, "Thank you." She was not sure who she was thanking. Maybe Arthur. Maybe Clara. Maybe the trees. Maybe the men who had cut them. Maybe herself. For staying. For not going to Providence. For being the kind of old woman who bought worthless swamp land because something inside her had refused to lie down and die when the world had told her to. The morning light moved across the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Somewhere out in the barn, Silas and Owen were already working. She could hear the faint sound of the saw. Steady. Familiar. The sound of 2 men making something out of the world. Eleanor smiled. She took a sip of her coffee. And out beyond the pasture, past the workshop, past the drying stacks of honey-colored wood, the swamp lay still under a rising Vermont sun. 1,700 logs had come out of it. Countless more remained. And they would remain, because Eleanor Whitfield had learned, in 4 years of pulling wood out of black water, the single lesson that no one had ever managed to teach her in 67 years of trying. Not everything hidden is meant to be found. Some things are meant to be honored. Some things are meant to be remembered. And some things, the deepest and oldest and most precious things, are meant simply to be left alone, so that the earth can keep them safe for whoever comes next. She finished her coffee. She stood up from the table. She walked out into the morning to begin her day.